Here is your 9-bullet outline. The cold that bites back. Introduce Yakutia's geography and the staggering reality of -71 degrees Celsius, setting the sensory stage for life at the coldest inhabited place on Earth. A land before thermometers. Explore the ancient Yakut and Evenki peoples who first settled this frozen basin, their origins, and how they learned to read cold before science named it. Dress to survive. Unpack the extraordinary layered clothing systems, reindeer hide, fox fur, and horsehair boots that stand between a Yakutian and certain death every single morning. Eating the freeze. Dive into the unique frozen food culture. Stroganina, flash-frozen raw fish, and how the permafrost itself becomes the world's most reliable refrigerator. The houses that breathe. Examine traditional and modern Yakutian architecture built on permafrost, including the engineering paradox of keeping a building warm without melting the ground beneath it. Animals, horses, and the mammoth's ghost. Survey the remarkable cold-adapted animals of Yakutia, from Yakutian horses that sleep in snowdrifts to the frozen mammoths still emerging from the thaw today. Daily life at the edge. Walk through an ordinary Yakutian day in deep winter. School runs at -50 degrees Celsius, frozen eyelashes, cars left running for months, and the social rituals that keep communities sane. Science, shamans, and the permafrost lab. Explore the intersection of ancient shamanic tradition and cutting-edge permafrost science, including what Yakutia's ice cores are telling climate researchers right now. The warming world and what Yakutia fears. Confront the paradox of climate change in the coldest place. Wildfires, thawing ground, and whether this ancient frozen culture can survive a warmer future. Awaiting, continue. Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we are going somewhere that will make your cozy bed feel like the greatest luxury ever invented by human civilization. Tonight we are going to Yakutia, a vast, silent, almost incomprehensibly cold corner of northeastern Russia where the thermometer has plunged to -71 degrees Celsius, where your breath freezes before it leaves your lips, where steel shatters like glass and exposed skin begins to die within minutes. This is not a place that merely gets cold in winter. This is a place where cold is the architecture of everything: the ground, the food, the houses, the animals, the people, and the very rhythm of daily life. You probably won't survive your first morning here, and that is not a joke dressed up as one. That is just Tuesday in Yakutia. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. Are you tucked in somewhere warm? Or are you one of the brave souls listening from somewhere that actually gets real winters? Either way, I want to know. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the edge of a concept that your body was simply never designed to process. -71 degrees Celsius. Let that number settle for a moment. Water freezes at 0. Your kitchen freezer sits around -18. The temperature at which carbon dioxide turns into dry ice, that theatrical fog you've seen at concerts and Halloween parties, is -78. You are not far from that. You are standing in a place where the air itself is barely above the point at which a gas used for industrial refrigeration becomes a solid. And people live here, willingly, generationally, with pride actually. Yakutia, formerly known as the Sakha Republic, is a federal subject of Russia so enormous that if it were its own country, it would be the largest country in the world after Russia itself. Wrap your mind around that. It covers over 3 million square kilometers, which is roughly the size of India, and yet its population is less than 1 million people. That works out to a population density of around 0.3 people per square kilometer. For comparison, Manhattan has about 27,000 people per square kilometer. Yakutia has the quiet. Yakutia has the space. Yakutia has the cold, and it is not sharing any of these things with the outside world in any hurry. The republic sits in the northeastern interior of the Asian continent, which is the crucial geographical detail that explains everything. Coastlines, moderate temperature. Oceans breathe warmth onto land, absorbing heat in summer and releasing it slowly through winter. Yakutia has none of that. It is landlocked in the deepest, most insulated way possible, ringed by mountain ranges that block any maritime air from reaching it. The Pacific is far. The Arctic Ocean is north, but its influence barely penetrates the ranges. What you get instead is a phenomenon called a Siberian high, a massive, stable dome of cold, dense air that settles over the region every winter and simply refuses to leave. The sun, even when it technically rises, schemes along the horizon at such a shallow angle that it delivers almost no heat. In the depths of January, Yakutsk, the regional capital and the largest city built on continuous permafrost in the world, receives only about 3 to 4 hours of faint, gray, nearly horizontal daylight. The rest is darkness, and the darkness is cold in a way that has texture. The specific place most associated with Yakutia's record-breaking cold is a small settlement called Oymyakon. This village sits in a valley, which sounds pleasant until you understand what valleys do in extreme cold. Cold air is dense. It sinks. Oymyakon's valley is essentially a bowl that collects the coldest air in the region and holds it there like a freezer with the lid on. On the 2nd of February, 1933, a Soviet meteorologist named Sergei Abrachev recorded a temperature of -67.7 degrees Celsius at Oymyakon, and this became the official record for the Northern Hemisphere's lowest naturally occurring temperature at an inhabited location. However, there is a second figure, -71.2 degrees Celsius, recorded on a monument in the village, a number that locals and some researchers cite, but which is disputed in terms of methodology and instrumentation. Historians still argue whether the -71 degrees Celsius figure represents a genuine measurement or an extrapolated estimate, and the debate remains warmly, if you will forgive the word, contested in climatological circles. What is not disputed is the feeling, and you are about to learn what that feeling is from the outside in, which is really the only survivable direction to approach it. Imagine stepping outside on such a morning. The door of your home opens, and the first thing you notice is the sound, or rather, the absence of it. Cold this profound has a way of deadening acoustics. Snow at these temperatures is not the wet, packing snow of a mild winter. It is dry and crystalline, so fine it barely makes a sound underfoot, almost like walking on a very cold, very firm powder. There is no wind, and this is important because at -50 degrees Celsius or below, even a gentle breeze becomes a lethal weapon. On still days, the cold is almost meditative. It just is. It presses against every exposed millimeter of your face with a firm, insistent, almost polite pressure, the way a very serious doctor might press a stethoscope to your chest. Then, within seconds, that politeness evaporates. Your nostril hairs freeze on your first inhale. This is not a metaphor. The moisture inside your nasal passages crystallizes immediately, and you feel a stiffening, a crinkle that is genuinely bizarre if you have never experienced it. Your eyelashes begin to frost over. The fine hairs on your face, if you have them, become small white filaments. If you wear glasses, they fog and then freeze, and now you are effectively blind as well as cold. Exhaled breath does not drift upward and dissipate the way it does on a brisk autumn morning. It falls. At -71 degrees Celsius, the water vapor in your breath freezes so quickly and densely that it drops as a tiny crystalline mist toward the ground, a phenomenon the Yakuts call the whisper of the stars, or in Russian sources, the crackling of the cold. The sound of breath freezing in still air at extreme temperatures is reportedly a soft, sustained hiss, like the universe itself is gently shushing you, which honestly feels appropriate. Your skin, any skin not covered, begins to experience frostnip within about 30 seconds of exposure. Frostbite follows within 2 minutes at these temperatures. The body, brilliantly and somewhat ruthlessly, begins to shut down blood flow to the extremities to protect the vital core organs. Your fingers, toes, ears, and nose are considered expendable by your own circulatory system. It will sacrifice them to keep your heart and lungs going, and it will do this without consulting you. The capillaries at the surface constrict aggressively. You feel a burning sensation, counterintuitively, as the tissue begins to suffer from lack of circulation, followed by a numbness that is genuinely dangerous because it removes the pain signal that would otherwise tell you to go inside immediately. You will go inside. You know this. Every person in Yakutia knows this. The cold is not something you fight here. Fighting cold in Yakutia is like fighting the tide. You manage it. You prepare for it. You respect it with a level of attention and ritual that people in milder climates reserve for major life events. Getting dressed to go outside in deep winter is not a casual act. It is closer to suiting up. The city of Yakutsk itself sits at around 62 degrees north latitude, roughly equivalent to Fairbanks, Alaska, or the southern tip of Greenland, and has a population of around 350,000 people. It has universities, theaters, a philharmonic orchestra, shopping centers, and restaurants. It has traffic jams, which is a sentence that feels like it belongs in a different story entirely but is completely true. People get in their cars that have been running all night, because if you turn off the engine in deep winter, there is a real chance it will not start again. And they sit in traffic in a city where the temperature outside would kill an unprotected person in minutes, and they are annoyed about the traffic. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Yakutia. Not the cold itself, but the complete normalization of it. The cold is simply the weather. Terrible, relentless, body-ending weather, but weather nonetheless. The permafrost underfoot, that permanently frozen layer of ground that extends in places to a depth of 1,500 meters beneath Yakutia, has been frozen for tens of thousands of years. It is not seasonal ice. It is geological fact. The active layer at the very surface thaws slightly in summer, turning parts of the landscape into boggy, mosquito-infested wetland, because Yakutia also has mosquitoes in summer, which feels deeply unfair. But below that thin skin of seasonal change, the earth is as permanently solid as bedrock. The Lena River, one of the longest rivers in the world, freezes to a depth that allows trucks to drive across it. Not snowmobiles. Trucks. The frozen river becomes a road, marked with signs and speed limits, and used as critical infrastructure for communities that have no other overland connection to the outside world during winter. The Yakut language has a rich and specific vocabulary for cold that does not translate neatly into English or Russian, because the people who developed it were cataloging an environment that demanded precision. There are distinctions between types of cold stillness, between the cold that comes before a storm and the cold that settles after one, between the feel of cold air at -40 degrees Celsius and at -60 degrees Celsius that go beyond mere temperature and speak to quality, to texture, to what the cold is doing and what it intends. This is what happens when a culture lives inside an experience so total and so defining. Language grows to meet it the way roots grow toward water. And underneath all of it, underneath the frozen river roads and the frosted eyelashes and the cars idling in the dark, there is a landscape of genuine, staggering beauty. The taiga forest, that enormous belt of coniferous trees that stretches across the northern latitudes, stands still in Yakutia's winter in a way that seems almost theatrical. The trees are Dahurian larch, which is the only tree species in the boreal forest that sheds its needles in winter, and in deep winter they stand as bare silver-gray skeletons against a sky that, on clear nights, is absolutely detonated with stars. The lack of light pollution across 3 million kilometers of nearly empty land means that the night sky over Yakutia is among the darkest and clearest on Earth. The Milky Way is not a faint smear here. It is a structural feature of the night. And above it all, when conditions are right, the northern lights, the aurora borealis, unfurl in slow, luminous curtains of green and violet across the black, moving with a silent, hypnotic grace that people in warmer, brighter places pay thousands of dollars to travel north to glimpse. You are not paying thousands of dollars tonight. You are lying down. You are warm. And we are only just beginning. Word count, 1,842 plus intro is almost equal to let me complete to target. The cold of Yakutia is not simply a climatic statistic. It is a presence. Locals will tell you that deep cold has a personality, that it announces itself, that it behaves differently on different nights, that it has moods. This is not mysticism, though mysticism certainly has a place in Yakutian culture, as you will discover. This is pattern recognition developed over dozens of generations of people who survived by paying close attention to what the cold was doing and what it was about to do. When the temperature drops below -50 degrees Celsius, certain things happen in sequence. Ice fog forms in inhabited areas, a phenomenon where the moisture from human activity, from cars and chimneys and breath, freezes instantly into a persistent, low-lying fog that sits over towns and villages like a cold blanket. From a distance, a settlement in Yakutia on a very cold day appears to be gently smoldering. The ice fog catches what little light there is and diffracts it into faint halos around lamps and headlights, turning the ordinary infrastructure of a city, streetlights, car headlights, lit windows, into something that looks, from a slight distance, genuinely ethereal. The record cold of -71 degrees Celsius is at one end of a spectrum, but the lived experience of Yakutia is really about the sustained cold, the weeks and months where the temperature simply does not rise above -40 degrees Celsius, where that is the warm end of the daily range. At these temperatures, physics behaves in ways that feel like magic until you understand them. A cup of boiling water thrown into the air at -40 degrees Celsius or below will produce an instant cloud of snow. The water freezes before it can fall. Rubber becomes brittle and cracks. Metals contract so significantly that door handles seize and mechanical joints fail. Tires go flat because the air inside them compresses and the rubber stiffens. The local mechanics of Yakutia have developed adaptations and workarounds for all of these things, the accumulated engineering wisdom of a society that has been solving cold weather mechanical problems for centuries. And yet, here is the quietly astonishing thing. The people of Yakutia, the indigenous Saka people, the Evenki, the Yukagir, and the Russian settlers who came later, have not merely survived here. They have built a culture here, a rich, complex, musically sophisticated, spiritually elaborate, culinarily inventive culture that uses the cold not as a backdrop but as a material. The cold is in the architecture and the food and the festivals and the poetry. The cold is in the jokes because yes, Yakutians have an entire genre of cold weather humor, the dry, extremely dry, in fact about -60 degrees Celsius dry, wit of people who have decided that if you cannot laugh at the fact that your snot freezes before it exits your nose, you are going to have a very long winter. And the winter in Yakutia is very, very long. We will get to all of it. The clothes, the food, the houses built on ice, the horses that sleep in the snow, the mammoths emerging from the thaw, the shamans, the scientists, and the unsettling future that a warming world is delivering to the coldest people on Earth. But for now, just settle into the knowledge that somewhere, right now, beneath a sky so full of stars it looks almost cluttered, in a silence so complete you could hear a snowflake land, a person in Yakutia is stepping outside into -50 degrees Celsius to collect firewood, moving with the practiced, unhurried confidence of someone who has done this 10,000 times and knows exactly how many minutes they have before the cold starts collecting its toll. They are not afraid. They are just going to get the firewood. That, more than any temperature record, is the story of Yakutia. Word count, 3,104. Awaiting, continue. Section 2. The people who first learned to call this frozen basin home did not arrive with thermometers or Gore-Tex or any of the other technologies that a modern person might consider the bare minimum for cold weather survival. They arrived with fire, with animal skins, with an intimate and generational knowledge of how living things behave when the world gets very, very cold, and with a remarkable capacity for adaptation that still quietly astonishes anthropologists today. To understand how anyone survives at -71 degrees Celsius, you first have to understand who decided to try in the first place, and why and what they carried with them, not in their hands but in their heads. The Saka people, who call themselves Saka, though the world has long known their homeland as Yakutia, a Russified version of the name, are not, as it turns out, originally from the coldest place on Earth. This is one of those historical details that sounds like it should change the story entirely, and in some ways it does. Genetic and linguistic evidence points to the Saka having migrated northward from the Lake Baikal region, a journey of thousands of kilometers that took place over several centuries and concluded somewhere around the 13th to 15th century CE. They brought with them cattle and horses, a detail that will matter enormously when we talk about what Yakutian horses have become, and a Turkic language that still carries within it the echoes of a warmer, southern homeland. The Saka language belongs to the same broad Turkic family as Turkish, Uzbek, and Kazakh, which is a linguistic connection so unexpected when you are standing in a place with -60 degrees Celsius winters that it almost feels like a geographical error. Why did they migrate north? The short answer is pressure. The movements and conflicts of peoples across Central Asia during the medieval period pushed some groups toward the margins, and the margins in northeastern Siberia were very marginal indeed. Historians still argue whether the Saka migration was a gradual ecological drift following river valleys and game northward over generations, or whether it involved more abrupt displacements driven by conflict with neighboring peoples. The Saka oral tradition speaks of heroic ancestor figures who led their people through impossible landscapes, and while oral tradition is not a substitute for archaeological documentation, it preserves something that archaeological data cannot: the emotional texture of a migration, the sense of what it felt like to move toward cold. When the Saka arrived in the Lena River basin, they encountered peoples who had been there far longer. The Evenki, a Tungusic-speaking people whose range extended across an enormous swath of Siberia, were already well established in the region, as were the Yukagir, one of the oldest indigenous groups in the area, whose population had been declining for centuries due to the pressures of competing peoples and, later, disease. The interactions between these groups were complex and layered. There was conflict, there was trade, and there was an exchange of knowledge that proved essential to survival. The Saka, arriving as cattle and horse herders from a relatively southern steppe environment, had to rapidly acquire the cold weather knowledge that the Evenki and Yukagir had developed over thousands of years. And they did. The rate at which the Saka people adapted to subarctic and Arctic conditions is considered remarkable by the standards of human cultural adaptation. The Evenki, for their part, were and remain some of the most skilled cold-weather nomads in human history. Their traditional lifestyle was built around reindeer herding and hunting across the taiga, the vast boreal forest, and their material culture was exquisitely calibrated to mobile survival in extreme cold. The Evenki developed techniques for constructing portable shelters, for processing and sewing animal hides in ways that maximized insulation while allowing the wearer to move and work, and for reading the landscape and weather with a precision that modern meteorology is only beginning to be able to replicate with instruments. The knowledge of how to read the color of the sky before a cold snap, how to interpret the behavior of animals as a temperature gauge, how to find water under ice and navigate across featureless frozen plains without losing direction. All of this accumulated over millennia and was encoded not in books but in practice, in story, in song, and in the habits of daily life. One of the most fascinating and underappreciated aspects of early Yakutian life is the role of the horse. Most cold-adapted peoples in the far north built their survival around reindeer. Animals superbly equipped for Arctic conditions, capable of digging through snow for lichen, wearing insulating fur, and being used for transport, food, and clothing all at once. The Saka brought horses, and they kept horses, and over generations those horses became something that no other horse population in the world quite matches. The Yakutian horse is a breed shaped by thousands of years of extreme cold selection, shorter, stockier, and shaggier than their southern relatives, with a metabolism that allows them to survive outdoors through Yakutian winters without supplemental feed, pawing through snow to find frozen grass in temperatures that would kill a domestic European horse within hours. These animals were not just livestock. They were partners in survival, and the Saka relationship with horses permeated their culture, their mythology, and their cuisine in ways that continue to this day. The cosmology that emerged from this landscape is one of the most elaborate indigenous spiritual systems in the world. Saka traditional religion, often called Tengrism, though the Saka version has its own distinct characteristics, understands the universe as a layered structure presided over by a pantheon of spirits called I and forces called Abihi. The upper world is warm and luminous, associated with beneficent creator spirits. The lower world is cold and dark, associated with malevolent forces. And then there is the middle world, the world of living humans, which sits, appropriately enough, in between, subject to the influence of both. The cold itself is personified in Saka cosmology as a powerful spirit, Chiskin, the Lord of Cold, sometimes described as an ancient being who controls the winter winds and the temperatures of the deep season. Chiskin is not simply evil. He is powerful and must be respected. This is perhaps the most sensible possible theological position when you live at the bottom of a valley where temperatures reach -71°C. You do not make enemies of things that can kill you that efficiently. The shaman, called an Oyun in Yakut, occupied a critical social and spiritual role in traditional Saka society. Shamanism in Yakutia is not the generic, decontextualized version that gets romanticized in wellness retreats in warmer parts of the world. It is a specific and demanding practice that involved the Oyun acting as an intermediary between the human community and the spirit world, conducting rituals to ensure successful hunts, to heal the sick, to negotiate with the spirits of cold and wind and water for favorable conditions, and to guide the souls of the dead. The initiation of a shaman in Saka tradition was an intense, sometimes years-long process that involved a kind of spiritual dismemberment and reconstruction. The candidate would experience what we might now recognize as a profound psychological crisis, interpreted within the tradition as the spirits literally taking the person apart and reassembling them as something new. Whether you interpret this literally or psychologically, The role it served in a community under constant environmental pressure was real and important. There is a quirky and wonderful detail buried in the ethnographic literature on Saka shamanism that deserves a moment. The ceremonial garment of the Saka Oyun was among the most elaborate ritual costumes in any shamanic tradition, heavy with metal discs and pendants, fringed with leather strips, decorated with representations of the spirits the shaman worked with. These costumes could weigh upward of 30 kilograms, and performing the rituals required wearing them while dancing and drumming for extended periods, sometimes hours. In the depths of a Yakutian winter, in a smoke-filled tent or dwelling, wearing 30 kilograms of metal and leather while dancing. This is what the spiritual work of the community looked like. The physical demands of traditional shamanism in Yakutia were not metaphorical. They were intensely, exhaustingly literal. The early Russian encounters with Yakutia and its peoples began in the 17th century, when Cossack explorers pushing eastward across Siberia in search of furs, the precious sable fur that was, at the time, one of the most valuable commodities in the world, reached the Lena River basin. The Russian advance was not gentle. It followed the familiar colonial pattern of establishing fortified outposts, demanding tribute in furs from indigenous peoples, and using violence to enforce compliance when it was not forthcoming. The Saka resisted, sometimes fiercely, but the combination of Russian military technology, introduced disease, and the disruption of traditional ways of life that came with incorporation into the Russian imperial economy ultimately reshaped Yakutian society in ways that neither the Saka nor the newcomers could fully anticipate. The city of Yakutsk was founded in 1632 as a Russian fort, an ostrog, on the banks of the Lena River. It is, by this measure, one of the older European-founded settlements in northeastern Asia, and one of the coldest permanently inhabited settlements ever established by deliberate colonial intention rather than indigenous adaptation. The Russians who came to Yakutsk in the 17th century were not acclimatized. They were not the product of generations of cold weather selection. They were men from relatively moderate Russian climates who had traveled east across Siberia and ended up in a place that was significantly, sometimes fatally, colder than anything in their experience. The mortality rates among early Russian settlers in Yakutia were significant. The cold did not particularly care about imperial ambitions. What the Russian colonists found, and what they were slow to fully acknowledge, was that the indigenous peoples of the region had already solved the central problem that was killing newcomers. The Saka and Evenki knew how to survive here. Their clothing, their food, their shelter, their daily routines, their understanding of the landscape, all of it represented thousands of years of accumulated cold weather problem solving that no amount of Russian determination could replicate from scratch in a single generation. The process by which Russian settlers gradually adopted Saka and Evenki technologies, the furs, the food, the boots, the understanding of when and how to move in extreme cold, is a story that does not often get told in the more triumphalist versions of Siberian colonial history, but it is a deeply human story about the direction in which knowledge actually flows when survival is at stake. The Saka managed something that many colonized peoples did not fully achieve. They maintained their language, their cultural identity, and many of their traditions through centuries of Russian rule, exile politics, Soviet collectivization, and the upheavals of the 20th century. The Saka language today is spoken by the vast majority of the Saka people and has official status in the Republic. Saka literature, music, and oral tradition, including the Elanco, the great Saka heroic epic, which UNESCO recognized as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2005, continue to be living, practiced parts of Yakutian cultural life, not museum pieces. The Elanco is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it tells you something important about how the people of this landscape understand themselves. These are long narrative poems. Some of them take days to perform in full, recounting the deeds of hero figures called Iar who battle monsters and spirits in a cosmos of vivid, sometimes terrifying beauty. The landscapes described in the Elanco are recognizably Yakutian: the frozen rivers, the taiga, the vast open spaces, rendered mythologically, elevated into a stage for struggles between warmth and cold, between life and death, between the ordered middle world of humans and the chaotic darkness below. The people who composed and transmitted the Elanco over centuries were not just storytelling for entertainment. They were making their landscape meaningful. They were saying, "This place, this impossible, beautiful, deadly place, is worth a great epic. We are worth a great epic." And as you lie there, warm under your blanket, perhaps beginning to feel the pleasant weight of sleep settling in around the edges of your thoughts, consider what it means to develop an entire cosmology, a rich spiritual and artistic tradition, a complex social structure, and a practical technology of survival, all in response to a place where the air itself freezes. The cold did not diminish the Saka people. It shaped them. It gave them their particular kind of knowledge, their particular kind of humor, their particular relationship to fire and food and animal and spirit. Every culture is a response to its landscape. The Saka response to their landscape is simply more extreme, more immediate, and more impressive than most. The thermometer was not invented until 1714, when Gabriel Fahrenheit produced the first mercury thermometer. The Saka had been reading and surviving the cold for centuries before anyone had a number to put on it. They did not need the number. They had the knowledge. And the knowledge, it turned out, was everything. Word count, 3,112. Awaiting, continue. Section 3. You are getting dressed. This sounds like one of the more straightforward activities a human being can undertake. The thing you have been doing since roughly age 3 without giving it a great deal of philosophical weight. In Yakutia, in January, getting dressed is a decision tree with survival at the end of it, and every branch matters. The wrong material against your skin is not a minor discomfort. It is the beginning of a sequence of events that ends badly. The wrong boot is not a fashion error. It is a medical situation developing at foot level. The people who figured out how to dress for -71 degrees Celsius did not do it with the benefit of modern textile science or sports apparel laboratories. They did it by paying very close attention to the consequences of getting it wrong, and then telling their children exactly what they had learned and so on for generations until the knowledge became second nature, or rather, first nature, the most fundamental thing you know before you know almost anything else. The foundational principle of cold weather dressing that the Saka and Evenki developed independently and in parallel with other Arctic peoples is one that modern outdoor gear companies now print on hang tags and advertise in glossy magazines as if they invented it: layering. But the indigenous layering system of Yakutia is not 3 shells from a sporting goods store. It is a precisely engineered, biologically informed system built from materials that took generations to identify and process correctly, worn in a specific sequence that manages the microclimate of the human body the way a thermostat manages a room, keeping warmth in, moving moisture out, and maintaining the narrow band of temperature in which the human body can continue to function. The innermost layer, worn directly against the skin, was traditionally made from the hide of young reindeer or fawn, worn with the fur facing inward toward the body. This is the detail that surprises people who think of fur as something worn fur-side out for warmth. The inward-facing fur creates an insulating air layer right at the skin surface, thousands of tiny fur shafts trapping a film of warm air against the body, functioning almost exactly the way the air pockets in modern synthetic insulation work, except that evolution had already optimized reindeer fur for this specific purpose in this specific climate over far more iterations than any human engineer has managed. Reindeer fur has a hollow shaft. Each individual hair is not solid but tubular, trapping even more air per hair than a solid shaft would. This is not a coincidence. Reindeer evolved in the same cold that the Evenki and Saka were trying to survive, and borrowing the reindeer's own thermal engineering was, if you think about it, one of the most elegant solutions in the history of human problem solving. Over this inner layer came a middle layer of heavier fur, often reindeer again, or sometimes fox, depending on availability and the specific garment, worn fur-side out this time, creating an outer insulating shell. The outer fur layer's job was slightly different from the inner one. It needed to shed snow and ice, to resist the mechanical abrasion of wind-driven ice crystals, and to prevent the penetration of cold air while still allowing the moisture that the body generates, sweat, exhaled air, to move outward and not accumulate against the skin. Wet insulation is a death sentence in extreme cold. The moment the inner layers begin to absorb moisture and lose their insulating air pockets, the body's heat deficit begins to grow, and in Yakutian temperatures, that deficit cannot be recovered outdoors. The outermost garment in the traditional Saka system was the doha, a long, fur coat reaching to mid-calf or below, belted at the waist, often decorated with geometric patterns and embroidery that were not merely aesthetic but carried cultural and spiritual significance. The belt itself was important. It sealed the coat around the midsection, preventing cold air from moving up inside the garment from below, which is one of the primary ways that body heat is lost in cold environments. A well-made doha from the pre-industrial era represented weeks of labor, the selection and preparation of hides, the cutting, the sewing with sinew thread that swelled when wet to seal its own seams, and the finishing work that made it durable enough to last multiple seasons of brutal use. A doha was not purchased. It was made, often by the women of the household, and its quality was a direct reflection of their skill, their knowledge, and their care. The Evenki contribution to cold-weather clothing in this region deserves particular attention. The Evenki were nomadic hunters and reindeer herders who covered enormous distances across the taiga in all seasons, which meant their clothing had to perform not just at rest or in a settlement, but during the sustained physical exertion of travel and hunting. Moving generates heat, which generates sweat, which dampens insulation, which becomes a problem the moment you stop moving. The Evenki developed garments with specific ventilation features, openings at the wrist and neck that could be opened and closed, designs that allowed a hunter moving quickly through the taiga to manage their own thermal output without removing layers and exposing themselves to the cold. This is, in essence, what the venting zippers on modern backcountry ski jackets are for, and the Evenki were solving this problem with leather and sinew a very long time before synthetic zippers were invented. The boots, called a turb or keeli in various Saka traditions, were arguably the most technically sophisticated element of the entire clothing system, and this is saying something given the quality of everything else. The boot construction used for extreme cold in Yakutia involved multiple layers of different materials, each selected for a specific property. The outer sole was traditionally made from the skin of the reindeer's leg, the leg skin specifically because it grows in a direction that naturally sheds snow and ice when you walk, the scale-like hair orientation acting as a one-way valve against moisture ingress. The inner boot was lined with dried grass, a material that sounds laughably low-tech until you understand that dried grass is an extraordinary insulator, flexible, breathable, moisture-absorbing, and entirely renewable in a landscape where you cannot exactly pop to the shops for replacement insoles. Historians still argue whether the specific grass species used for boot lining in traditional Yakutian footwear was selected through systematic knowledge or accumulated trial and error over generations, but either way, the result was a boot that kept feet warm at temperatures where modern winter boots, the kind you buy at a department store, would fail completely. There is a quirky footnote in the ethnographic literature about Yakutian footwear that is almost too good not to share. Traditional Saka winter boots were often made without a left or right distinction. Both boots were cut symmetrically, allowing them to be swapped between feet on alternating days to distribute wear evenly. This approach, which seems eccentric from the perspective of modern ergonomic footwear design, was actually a highly practical solution to the problem of boot longevity in a context where replacing worn-out footwear was not a simple matter of going to a store. You made your boots last. Every technique that extended their lifespan was worth knowing. The head and face covering situation in Yakutia was, and remains, a study in creative problem-solving under constraint. The human head loses a disproportionate amount of body heat relative to its surface area, which is why your mother always told you to wear a hat, and which is why traditional Yakutian head coverings were among the most insulated garments in the entire ensemble. The traditional hat was a fur-lined, ear-covering design that tied under the chin and could be pulled down over the forehead to protect the most temperature-sensitive area of the face. In extreme temperatures, an additional face covering, sometimes a separate fur mask, sometimes a fabric wrap, was added, leaving only the eyes and the smallest possible area of skin exposed to the air. Some traditional designs incorporated a small brim over the eyes to prevent wind-driven ice crystals from reaching the surface of the eye, a genuinely painful problem at extreme temperatures, where the eye's own moisture can begin to freeze on the cornea surface. The mittens, not gloves, deserve a mention. Every cold-weather culture independently arrives at the same conclusion about hand coverings in extreme cold. Individual fingers are a thermal disaster. Each finger has a high surface area to volume ratio and must be individually perfused with warm blood, which the body struggles to maintain efficiently at extreme temperatures. A mitten, by contrast, allows the fingers to share warmth with each other, reducing the effective surface area and allowing the hand to pool its heat in a single insulated chamber. Traditional Yakutian mittens were large, generous, fur-lined, and attached to the coat sleeve by a strap or cord so that they could be dropped without being lost. Because if you are handling equipment or working with your hands outdoors and you drop an unattached mitten in a wind, you are now in a time-critical situation. The strap is not a quirk. The strap is engineering. Modern Yakutians use all of this traditional knowledge alongside contemporary materials, and the synthesis is fascinating to observe. The reindeer fur has largely given way to commercially produced down and synthetic insulation for everyday wear, but the layering principle remains exactly the same. Local outdoor gear produced in and for Yakutia incorporates traditional design wisdom, the importance of the face covering, the boot construction philosophy, the ventilation principles into modern materials. There is a thriving market for custom-made traditional clothing in Yakutia, both for cultural events and festivals and for practical use, because there are still contexts. Long journeys by sled or snowmobile across open terrain, hunting trips into the taiga, where traditional fur clothing outperforms anything made in a factory, for the simple reason that it was designed specifically for this place by people who lived and died by its performance. The preparation of animal hides for clothing in the traditional Yakushan manner was itself a complex, labor-intensive art form, and the knowledge of how to do it correctly was one of the most valuable practical skills a person could possess. The process of tanning reindeer hide to produce a leather soft enough to sew, durable enough to withstand cold and moisture, and flexible enough not to crack and stiffen in extreme temperatures involved techniques that took years to master. One of the traditional methods used by Evenki women involved chewing the hide to soften it. Yes, literally using teeth and jaw muscles as a processing tool. A method that resulted in the remarkable suppleness of the finished product but also contributed over a lifetime of practice to significant dental wear. Anthropologists examining skeletal remains of Evenki women have noted this wear pattern as a physical signature of the hide-working tradition. There is something quietly moving about this detail, that the warmth of a well-made coat, the survival it represented, was literally built into the bodies of the women who made it. The cold was not just something you put clothes on against. It was something you worked, every day, with your hands and your teeth and your knowledge to hold back. And you held it back because the people you loved were on the other side of that effort, alive and warm. The children's clothing system in traditional Yakushan culture was essentially a smaller version of the adult system, with some additional features specific to the needs of small bodies that generate less heat and lose it more rapidly. Infants were kept in a birch bark cradle lined with fur and dried moss, the moss serving as both insulation and a natural absorbent material. A moss diaper, essentially, that was one of the more practical solutions to infant care in a context where washing cloth was not a simple matter in extreme cold. Older children were dressed in miniature versions of adult cold weather garments and were taught from very young ages the rules of cold exposure, how to recognize the early signs of frostbite in themselves and others, when to go inside, how to warm a chilled hand without warming it too fast, and never, ever to touch metal with bare skin at low temperatures. That last rule, do not touch bare metal in extreme cold, is one that every child in Yakutia learns at approximately the same age that children elsewhere learn not to touch a hot stove. At -50 degrees Celsius, bare metal conducts heat away from the skin so rapidly that contact for even a few seconds can result in the skin freezing to the surface, and tearing the skin free without careful warming can cause serious injury. There are accounts, possibly apocryphal but widely circulated, of people whose tongues have briefly contacted metal surfaces in extreme cold, a scenario that ends poorly and that no amount of storytelling embellishment is really needed to make more dramatic. The physics does that on its own. What all of this adds up to is a clothing culture that is not about fashion or about status or about self-expression, though all of those things exist in Yakushan dress in various ways, particularly in the decorative elements of traditional garments, but about survival engineering. Every design choice in the traditional Yakushan clothing system exists because someone, at some point, learned through cold and painful experience what happened when that choice was made differently. The knowledge was tested at temperatures that do not forgive errors, and what survived that testing and was passed down is a system that kept human beings alive in the coldest inhabited place on Earth for centuries before synthetic insulation, polar fleece, or heated car seats were even conceptually possible. You are warm right now, presumably, and a not insignificant portion of the reason that warmth feels unremarkable to you, that you can lie there in a conditioned room under a manufactured blanket wearing clothes produced by an industrial system without giving survival a single thought, is that you exist at the end of a very long chain of human beings who figured out one painful lesson at a time, how to keep a body alive when the world tries very hard to freeze it. Yakushans just had to solve that problem more urgently and more completely than almost anyone else. Word count, 3089. Awaiting, continue. Section 4. You are hungry. In Yakutia, this is not a casual state of being. Not the mild, negotiable hunger of someone who has skipped a snack and is considering their options. Hunger in extreme cold is a metabolic emergency developing in slow motion, because your body, working furiously to maintain its core temperature against a minus 50 degrees Celsius environment, is burning through calories at a rate that would astonish a nutritionist from a warmer climate. The human body in extreme cold can require upward of 6,000 calories per day just to maintain basic thermal homeostasis, roughly 3 times what a moderately active person in a temperate climate needs. You are not eating for pleasure here or for social connection, or because it is noon and that is what noon means. You are eating because if you do not eat enough of the right things, the cold will find the gap in your energy budget and begin collecting interest. The food culture of Yakutia is one of the most distinctive and, to outside eyes, most startling culinary traditions in the world. It is built around a simple and uncompromising ecological fact. In a landscape where winter temperatures preclude agriculture for most of the year, where the growing season is compressed into a few intense summer months, and where the dominant natural resources are animal fish, reindeer, horse, elk, wild birds, the food system must be almost entirely protein and fat-based, must be preservable without refrigeration equipment because the environment itself is the refrigerator, and must deliver maximum caloric density in minimum volume because carrying food across a winter landscape is its own physical challenge. The permafrost that sits below Yakutia's surface and extends, in places, to a depth of 1,500 meters is the oldest and most reliable cold storage system in the history of human food preservation. Long before anyone invented a refrigerator, before anyone understood the microbiology of spoilage, the people of Yakutia understood empirically that food placed in the permafrost would keep. Not just for a season, not just for a year. The permafrost is so stable in temperature, hovering around minus 5 degrees Celsius to minus 10 degrees Celsius in the upper layers, that it preserves biological material with a fidelity that has astonished modern scientists. The mammoths we will discuss later are the most famous example of this preservative power, but for the people living above the permafrost, the practical application was the meat cellar. The Yakutian meat cellar, a bulbous or similar structure, is essentially a pit dug down into the permafrost layer, accessed by a ladder or steps, where food is stored at naturally sub-zero temperatures year-round. Modern Yakutian homes in both urban and rural settings frequently have access to permafrost cellars, and they function with a reliability that no electrical refrigerator can match in terms of energy cost. Because the energy cost is zero, the Earth provides the cold for free indefinitely as long as the permafrost itself remains intact. A family's permafrost cellar might contain frozen fish, frozen horse meat, frozen game, butter, and other preserved food stacked and organized with the same care that someone in a warmer climate might organize a pantry. The cellar is not a backup storage option. It is the primary food security system of the household. Stroganina is perhaps the most iconic dish in the Yakutian culinary tradition, and it is one of those foods that sounds alarming to outside ears and then, when properly encountered, converts people with an efficiency that is almost suspicious. Stroganina is raw, frozen fish, typically whitefish species such as muksun, nelma, or chur, which are caught in the Lena River and its tributaries, that is shaved into thin curling strips with a sharp knife and eaten immediately, while still frozen. The texture is unlike anything in the culinary experience of most people from temperate climates. The thin shavings melt on the tongue almost instantaneously, delivering a clean, pure fish flavor without any of the fishiness that comes from decomposition or oxidation, because the freezing has effectively paused all of those processes completely. The fish is dipped in salt, sometimes with black pepper, and eaten standing up, often outdoors or in an unheated space, because bringing frozen stroganina into a warm room starts the thawing process and changes the texture and flavor in ways that Yakutians consider unacceptable. There is an art to the stroganina knife technique that takes practice. The fish is held vertically, frozen solid, and the knife is drawn toward the body in a smooth, curling motion that produces a thin, slightly translucent ribbon of frozen fish that holds its curl for a moment before being eaten. Watching someone skilled at stroganina preparation is genuinely mesmerizing. The rhythmic motion, the accumulating pile of pale curling shavings, the economy of movement. It is, in its own way, as precise a culinary technique as any in the classical French tradition, and considerably colder. The raw horse meat tradition in Yakutia is another element of the food culture that tends to generate strong reactions from outsiders, and is worth understanding in context before judgment arrives. The Saka relationship with the horse, as we touched on earlier, is not the relationship of a riding culture with a beast of burden. It is the relationship of a pastoral people with their primary livestock, an animal that provides transport, yes, but also milk and leather and, crucially, meat. Foal meat in particular is prized in Yakutian cuisine, and like the fish, it is often consumed frozen and raw. The fat content of Yakutian horse meat is exceptionally high. The horse's own metabolic adaptations to extreme cold result in a fat-rich muscle tissue that delivers the caloric density that a human body operating in extreme cold genuinely needs. This is not culinary eccentricity. This is a food system precisely calibrated to the energy demands of life in the coldest inhabited place on Earth. The fat component of the Yakutian diet deserves its own consideration, because it is so central and so counterintuitive to anyone raised on the dietary advice of the last few decades of Western nutrition science. Yakutians eat a lot of fat. A lot. Animal fat, from fish, from horse, from reindeer, forms a foundational part of the caloric intake, and indigenous Yakutian food culture has never had any particular anxiety about this, for the simple reason that the fat works. The body metabolizing fat in extreme cold produces sustained, slow-burning heat that carbohydrates simply cannot match. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic regions who subsisted primarily on animal protein and fat were, metabolically, operating on what modern nutritionists are only now beginning to investigate seriously as a cold-adapted dietary pattern. Historians still argue whether the apparently low incidence of certain metabolic diseases among traditional Arctic populations was a result of the fat-heavy diet, genetic adaptations to that diet, the extreme physical activity levels required for traditional subsistence lifestyles, or some combination of all three. One of the more remarkable food preservation techniques in the Yakutian tradition involves fermentation rather than freezing, a method that sounds paradoxical in a culture built around cold but makes sense when you understand the seasonal logic. During summer, when the active layer of permafrost thaws slightly and temperatures rise enough for microbial activity, certain foods were deliberately fermented using controlled decomposition. Fermented fish, inhabited, is made from fish that has been left to ferment in a covered container for an extended period, producing a pungent, intensely flavored product that delivers a density of nutrients and, importantly, the fat-soluble vitamins that are otherwise difficult to obtain in a diet without plant foods. The smell of fermented fish products in indigenous Arctic traditions is, by the polite assessment of people encountering them for the first time, challenging. By the less polite assessment of some visiting journalists and researchers, it is extraordinary. But the nutritional logic is impeccable. The Lena River and its tributary system is the foundation of Yakutian food security in a way that is difficult to overstate. The river is enormous, the 11th longest river in the world, and its cold, clean waters support fish populations of exceptional quality and abundance. The annual fish catch has been a cornerstone of Yakutian food supply for as long as people have lived in the region, and the techniques developed for fishing in extreme cold are as specialized as everything else in this cold-adapted culture. Ice fishing in Yakutia is not the genteel, recreational ice fishing with a rod and a thermos that people in Minnesota or Ontario practice on frozen lakes. It is a serious, sustained, sometimes large-scale operation involving nets set under thick river ice, maintained through ice holes that must be kept from refreezing, and requiring significant physical effort and cold weather endurance. The nets are set by threading them under the ice using long poles, a technique that requires knowing exactly where the fish are moving under the frozen surface. Knowledge that is acquired through years of observation and local experience and cannot simply be looked up. Summer in Yakutia is short and, in terms of food gathering, explosively productive. The long summer days, the sun barely sets in June and July at these latitudes, resulting in nearly 24 hours of daylight, produce an intense burst of biological productivity. Berries, cloudberries, crowberries, blueberries, lingonberries, ripen in enormous quantities across the tundra and taiga, and the gathering and preservation of berries was a significant summer activity in traditional Yakutian life. Frozen berries stored in the permafrost cellar provided vitamin C through the winter months, a crucial nutritional supplement in a diet otherwise almost entirely composed of animal products. The relationship between berry gathering and the prevention of scurvy in Arctic populations is not widely discussed outside of nutritional anthropology, but it was a genuinely life-or-death dependency in the pre-contact era. Wild plants, certain species of roots, shoots, and herbs available during the brief summer, also supplemented the largely carnivorous winter diet. The knowledge of which plants were nutritious, which were medicinally useful, and which were toxic was part of the essential ecological knowledge that Yakutian women in particular maintained and transmitted. This botanical knowledge, developed in a landscape where the plant-growing season is so compressed and the number of available species so limited compared to temperate environments, represents a remarkably precise pharmacopoeia assembled under extreme ecological constraints. There is a wonderful quirk in the modern Yakutian food culture that serves as a perfect bridge between the ancient and the contemporary. The city of Yakutsk has restaurants, proper restaurants with menus and waitstaff and wine lists, that serve traditional Sakha cuisine alongside Russian dishes and, increasingly, international cuisine. And in these restaurants, stroganina is on the menu. Not as a novelty, not as a heritage dish served once a year at a cultural festival. As an everyday item, ordered by locals the way someone in Tokyo orders sashimi, routinely, knowledgeably, with specific preferences about species and preparation. The chef at a good Yakutsk stroganina restaurant has opinions about fish texture and blade angle the way a sushi master has opinions about rice temperature and fish freshness, and these opinions are held with equivalent seriousness and passion. The food of Yakutia is not despite the cold. It is of the cold, made by the cold, shaped by the cold, and possible only because of the cold. The permafrost cellar that keeps food frozen through the summer is the same geological feature that makes the landscape impossible to farm. The horse fat that sustains a body through a Yakutian January is produced by the same metabolic adaptations that allow the horse to survive outdoors through that same January. The frozen fish eaten raw and standing up in an unheated room is the product of a river system made productive by the same cold that makes the surrounding landscape nearly uninhabitable. In Yakutia, the thing that tries to kill you and the thing that keeps you alive are frequently the same thing, viewed from slightly different angles. This is, if you think about it, a rather sophisticated relationship with one's environment. Not the adversarial relationship, us against the cold, warmth against freeze, life against death, that outsiders tend to project onto extreme climates, but something more nuanced. The cold is a resource. The cold is a tool. The cold is the condition under which everything here has evolved, the fish, the horses, the berries, the people, and using it intelligently, rather than fighting it uselessly, is the central survival wisdom of Yakutian culture. You do not defeat the cold. You learn its properties and you put them to work. Which brings us, naturally, to the question of where you sleep when the cold is minus 60 degrees Celsius outside and the only thing between you and it is the walls of your house. And the walls of your house are sitting on ground that is permanently, geologically, profoundly frozen, and which will very much like to stay that way. Word count, 3,127. Awaiting, continue. Section 5. The house you are about to sleep in tonight is, by the standards of Yakutian architectural engineering, either a marvel or a cautionary tale, and possibly both simultaneously. Building a home in Yakutia is not the same engineering problem as building a home anywhere else on Earth, and the reason for this comes back to the permafrost, that deep, ancient geological freeze that sits beneath the surface like a silent landlord with very specific requirements and absolutely no patience for tenants who ignore them. The permafrost does not negotiate. It does not compromise. If you build a structure that warms the ground beneath it, the permafrost will thaw, and thawing permafrost does not simply get softer, it collapses. It liquefies. It turns from a surface as solid as concrete into something closer to cold mud, and your house, which was sitting on what you thought was bedrock, begins to tilt and sink and crack in ways that progress from inconvenient to catastrophic with a speed that will genuinely surprise you. This is not a theoretical problem. Drive through Yakutsk today and you will see it with your own eyes. Buildings that have developed alarming tilts, staircases that no longer align with doorways, walls that have cracked along diagonal fault lines as different sections of the foundation settled at different rates into the softening ground below. These are not old buildings in dramatic disrepair. Some of them are relatively recent constructions that underestimated the thermal relationship between structure and permafrost. The ground beneath Yakutsk has been disturbed by a century of urban development, and in some areas the permafrost table has dropped significantly, producing a landscape of subsidence and structural distress that the city's engineers work continuously to monitor and address. The traditional Sakha solution to the problem of building on permafrost was elegant in the way that the best engineering solutions always are. It worked with the physics rather than against it. The traditional Saka dwelling, called a balagan, was a low, trapezoidal log structure with walls that sloped inward slightly toward the top, constructed from horizontally stacked logs and covered with a mixture of clay, dung, and earth to provide additional insulation. The critical design feature was the floor. The balagan sat on the surface of the permafrost with a minimal foundation footprint, and the floor was typically the frozen ground itself, covered with animal hides and dried grass for insulation. The heating system, a central fireplace with a chimney, was designed to heat the air of the dwelling without transferring excessive heat into the ground below, a balance that the builders maintained through the thickness of the floor covering and the elevation of the fire above the ground surface. The balagan was not a warm structure by modern standards. Winter interior temperatures were kept at what we might generously describe as above freezing and hopefully not much below, which sounds inadequate until you appreciate that the alternative was outside, where the temperature was 60 or 70 degrees lower. The interior of a traditional Saka balagan on a deep winter night was a world of layered furs and bodies and fireglow, with the smoke of the central fire providing both heat and a certain atmospheric quality that modern building codes would have opinions about. The small windows, covered with fish bladder membrane or thin sheets of ice rather than glass, which was unavailable, admitted a dim, diffused light during the brief daylight hours and were sealed shut at night to prevent heat loss. The door was small and low, requiring occupants to duck to enter, a design feature that minimized the volume of cold air introduced each time someone came in or went out. The animals lived close. In the deepest cold, cattle and horses were sometimes kept in an adjoining structure connected to the main dwelling, their body heat contributing to the thermal budget of the household in a way that was entirely practical and not at all the romantic farmyard image it might conjure. A cow produces a significant amount of heat, roughly equivalent to a small electric heater, and in a Yakutian January, that heat was not something you left outside in a separate barn if you could possibly arrange otherwise. The smell was a price paid without complaint. When Russian settlers began building more permanent structures in Yakutia in the 17th and 18th centuries, they initially attempted to use the construction methods they knew from warmer Russian climates. Buildings with conventional foundations dug into the ground, wood frame structures without the careful thermal management of the balagan. The results were instructive. Buildings subsided. Foundations cracked. Cellars flooded when permafrost thawed around them in summer. The newcomers learned, gradually and expensively, that building in Yakutia required a fundamentally different approach, and that the principles the Saka had been applying for centuries were not primitive workarounds but sophisticated responses to a genuinely difficult engineering problem. The modern solution to building on permafrost, the one you see in contemporary Yakutsk and in purpose-built structures throughout the region, is one of the more counterintuitive ideas in civil engineering, and it is beautiful in its logic. You keep the permafrost frozen on purpose. Modern buildings in Yakutia are typically raised on stilts, concrete or metal piles driven deep into the permafrost, with a gap of anywhere from half a meter to several meters between the underside of the building's floor and the ground surface. This gap allows cold air to circulate freely beneath the building, carrying away any heat that might otherwise conduct downward from the heated interior and begin thawing the permafrost below. The building floats above the ground on its stilts, thermally isolated from the frozen earth, which remains frozen and therefore structurally sound. Walk through the center of Yakutsk and look at the legs of the buildings. They are there, those stilts, holding up Soviet-era apartment blocks and modern office buildings and schools and hospitals, the entire built environment of a city of 350,000 people perched above its own ground like a cautious bird on a frozen branch. The pipes that carry water and heating through the city cannot be buried underground, as they are in temperate cities, because burial would warm the surrounding ground and compromise the permafrost. Instead, the infrastructure of Yakutsk runs above ground, through insulated conduits called communicatii that run along the streets at chest height, silvery insulated tubes carrying the warmth of the city's heating network through the frozen air from one building to the next like an exposed circulatory system. In winter, these insulated pipe runs accumulate frost on their outer surfaces, a fine crystalline coating that catches the pale winter light and gives the streets of the city a faintly surreal, science fiction quality that photographs remarkably well. The heating infrastructure of Yakutsk is centralized, a Soviet-era legacy that, whatever its ideological origins, turns out to be extremely practical in a climate where individual household heating systems are more vulnerable to failure and more expensive to maintain. The city runs on a central district heating network powered primarily by coal-fired plants, which pump hot water through those above-ground pipe networks into every connected building. The redundancy built into the system is considerable, because a heating system failure in Yakutsk in January is not an inconvenience. It is an emergency with a very short window before it becomes a tragedy. Backup systems, emergency protocols, and around-the-clock maintenance crews are part of the standard operating picture of urban infrastructure in the coldest city on Earth. The windows of buildings in Yakutsk deserve a moment of appreciation. Triple glazing is the absolute minimum, 3 panes of glass with sealed air gaps between them, providing insulation values that would be considered over-engineered in most European climates and are considered barely adequate here. Many buildings use 4-pane glazing, or combine triple glazing with interior window insulation systems. The frames are designed to prevent thermal bridging, the phenomenon where a metal or even wooden frame conducts cold from the outside pane to the inside surface, creating cold spots where frost forms on the interior glass surface and heat bleeds out. On the coldest nights, even well-insulated windows accumulate interior frost in the corners, growing slowly inward from the edges in feathery crystalline patterns that are, objectively, quite beautiful and which Yakutian residents regard with the same mild, habituated interest that a person in a humid climate regards condensation on a cold glass. The question of ventilation in extreme cold is one of those problems that sounds simple until you think about it carefully. A sealed, well-insulated building in -60°C weather will maintain its interior temperature efficiently, but it will also accumulate the carbon dioxide exhaled by its occupants, the moisture from cooking and bathing and breathing, and the various combustion products of any gas or wood heating systems inside. Opening a window to ventilate is not a casual gesture at these temperatures. A window open for 5 minutes in deep cold can drop a room's temperature significantly and introduce enough cold air to take hours to reheat. Modern Yakutian buildings use heat recovery ventilation systems, mechanical ventilators that draw fresh outside air in while extracting heat from the outgoing stale air, maintaining interior air quality without hemorrhaging the precious thermal energy that the heating system is working to maintain. This technology, increasingly common in energy-efficient buildings globally, was effectively a necessity in Yakutia long before it became a sustainability choice elsewhere. The dachas, the small seasonal country homes that Russians and Saka alike maintain outside the city, present a different set of cold-weather architectural challenges. A dacha is typically not heated through the winter when unoccupied, which means returning to it after weeks of absence involves walking into a space that has equilibrated to outdoor temperatures. Returning to a dacha in January means returning to a building that may be -40°C inside, where the water pipes, if it has them, have frozen solid, where any food left behind has frozen and possibly burst its containers, and where the process of bringing the interior to habitable temperature takes hours of careful, graduated heating to avoid cracking cold-stiffened materials with too rapid thermal expansion. Yakutians who maintain dachas develop detailed protocols for winterizing them in autumn and dewinterizing them in spring that are, in their procedural detail and careful sequencing, closer to the checklists used by pilots than to anything most people associate with home maintenance. There is a charming and slightly absurd architectural detail specific to Yakutsk that speaks to the creativity required when standard engineering assumptions do not apply. The city's older residential buildings, Soviet-era apartment blocks of the 5-story Khrushchev-era type known as Khrushchevki, built rapidly across the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 1960s using standardized designs developed for temperate climates, were not designed for Yakutian conditions. They were parachuted in, architecturally speaking, from a design bureau in Moscow that was solving a housing shortage problem, not a permafrost engineering problem, and the results over the following decades were predictable. Many of these buildings have developed significant structural issues as the permafrost beneath them has been compromised by the heat of occupation, and the city has spent decades retrofitting, reinforcing, and in some cases demolishing and replacing them. The lesson, build for your actual environment, not for the environment the designer was familiar with, is one that Yakutia has taught expensively and repeatedly to successive generations of planners who arrived with outside assumptions. The most extreme residential construction challenge in the Yakutian context is the remote settlement, the small villages scattered across the Republic's vast territory, many of them accessible only by air or by winter road, where construction materials must be flown or sledged in at enormous expense and where the local knowledge base for cold weather building is the community's own accumulated tradition. These villages maintain a building culture that is a living synthesis of traditional Saka architectural principles and whatever modern materials have been made available through the Soviet and post-Soviet supply system. A mix that produces structures of considerable resourcefulness and occasional structural adventure. A wall might combine hand-cut logs with Soviet-era insulation board with a modern vapor barrier installed by someone who watched a video about it. Layered solutions to layered problems, improvised from available materials by people who understand the fundamental physics of what they are doing even if they would not describe it in engineering terms. The permafrost itself, that eternal frozen foundation, has one more architectural role to play that we have not yet mentioned. It is also where the dead are buried. Or rather, and this is the relevant complication, where the dead cannot easily be buried. In deep winter, the frozen ground of Yakutia is as impenetrable as concrete. Digging a grave in January requires equipment and effort that is simply not practical in remote communities. The traditional practice in some communities was to keep the deceased above ground, in a cold outbuilding or structure, until spring softened the active layer enough for burial. This is one of those practical accommodations to extreme cold that the living make with a matter-of-fact pragmatism that would seem jarring in a culture less intimately acquainted with the physical realities of their environment, but which in Yakutia is simply one more example of letting the cold be what it is and working around it accordingly. The house you sleep in tonight, wherever you are, sits on ground that is not frozen or not frozen deeply or not frozen permanently, and this is a fact you have probably never given a single thought to in your entire life. The ground beneath your home is simply there, stable, reliable, inert. In Yakutia, the ground has opinions. It has conditions. It will remain stable only if you treat it correctly, only if the building above it is designed to keep it cold, only if the climate that has frozen it for tens of thousands of years continues to do so. The house in Yakutia is not just a shelter from the cold. It is a negotiation with it, a careful, ongoing, engineering conversation between the warmth of human habitation and the ancient freeze of the earth below. And outside those negotiated walls, in the dark and the cold and the absolute stellar silence, something is moving through the snow on 4 legs, completely unconcerned. Word count, 3089. Awaiting, continue. Section 6. The animal moving through the snow outside your hypothetical Yakushin window is not struggling. This is the first and most important thing to understand about the fauna of this landscape. The animals that belong here are not enduring the cold the way a human being endures it, with layers and fire and carefully engineered shelter and a great deal of metabolic effort. They are operating within it, shaped by it over millennia of selection so thorough and so precise that the cold is not their enemy any more than water is the enemy of a fish. The cold is their medium. It is the condition under which they have become exactly what they are, and removing it, warming their world, would be the actual catastrophe, not the temperature that makes your nose hairs freeze on contact. The Yakushin horse is where we must begin, partly because we promised to return to it and partly because it is genuinely one of the more remarkable animals on Earth when you examine it closely. The domestic horse, in most of the world, is a creature of paddocks and stables and hay deliveries and blankets thrown over its back on cold nights. The Yakushin horse, the breed that descended from the horses brought north by the Saka ancestors and then shaped by centuries of brutal cold weather selection, spends its winters outdoors, not in a heated barn, not in a shelter, outdoors in the open taiga and river valleys of Yakutia, in temperatures that can reach minus 60 degrees Celsius, with no supplemental feed provided by humans, surviving entirely on whatever frozen vegetation it can excavate from beneath the snow by pawing with its front hooves. The physical adaptations that make this possible are extensive and visible. The Yakushin horse is shorter and more compact than most domestic breeds. A stocky, barrel-chested animal with shorter legs relative to body size, minimizing the surface area from which heat can radiate while maximizing the core volume that generates and retains it. The winter coat is extraordinary. A dense, shaggy covering that can reach 10 centimeters in length, with a thick undercoat of fine insulating fiber beneath the longer guard hairs, giving the animal the slightly disreputable look of a very cold, very unconcerned mop. Beneath the skin, a layer of subcutaneous fat, thicker than in any other domestic horse breed, provides additional insulation and a reserve of metabolic fuel for the coldest periods when foraging becomes most difficult. The hooves of the Yakushin horse are broader than those of other breeds and have a concave underside that functions as a natural snow shovel. allowing the horse to dig efficiently through compacted snow to reach the frozen grasses and sedges beneath. This behavior, called cratering or paving, is the horse's primary winter feeding strategy, and the efficiency with which a Yakutia horse can excavate frozen vegetation from under significant snow cover is genuinely impressive to watch. They work in a systematic, unhurried way, sweeping snow aside with one hoof, exposing a patch of frozen grass, cropping it with their teeth, which are adapted to handle frozen material without the tooth damage that would result in a less cold-adapted animal, and then moving to the next patch with the focused efficiency of an animal that understands precisely how much energy its foraging costs versus how much it delivers. Genetically, the Yakutia horse has been the subject of considerable scientific interest, and the results have been illuminating. Studies of the Yakutia horse genome have identified specific genetic variants related to thermogenesis, the cellular generation of heat, that differ significantly from those found in other horse breeds. Particular attention has focused on genes related to hair follicle development, fat metabolism, and the regulation of blood flow to the extremities. The horse's circulatory system includes adaptations that allow it to dramatically reduce blood flow to the lower legs in extreme cold, a countercurrent heat exchange mechanism similar to that found in Arctic marine mammals, keeping the core body temperature stable while allowing the hooves and lower legs to cool significantly below core temperature without tissue damage. Historians still argue whether the Yakutia horse's genetic distinctiveness is primarily the result of the original founder population brought north by the Saka, who may have selected animals with cold tolerance traits from the beginning, or whether the extreme cold weather adaptations developed primarily through natural selection after arrival in Yakutia. But either way, the result is an animal that has no close parallel anywhere else in the domestic horse world. The reindeer, domesticated by the Evenki and other northern peoples, wild populations roaming across the tundra, are in some ways the opposite case from the Yakutia horse, an animal that came pre-adapted for the Arctic and was then incorporated into human subsistence systems that exploited those adaptations. Reindeer are extraordinary cold weather animals in ways that go beyond the obvious fur coat. Their hooves change seasonally, hardening in summer for traction on rocky ground and softening in winter to improve grip on snow and ice. A biological switchover that has no close parallel in other ungulates. Their nasal passages are extraordinarily convoluted, warming and humidifying inhaled air before it reaches the lungs with a heat exchange efficiency that prevents the cold air lung damage that would otherwise result from breathing -50°C air during sustained physical activity. Their eyes contain a reflective layer, the tapetum lucidum, that enhances low-light vision, and the specific cells in this layer shift their light absorption properties seasonally in response to changing day length, improving sensitivity in the polar winter darkness. Reindeer can see in the ultraviolet spectrum, which is invisible to humans, and which allows them to detect wolf urine on snow, a survival advantage in a landscape where wolves are a constant presence, as a dark patch against the bright UV-reflective snow surface. The wolf of Yakutia is a large, cold-adapted subspecies of the gray wolf, bigger than its southern relatives, with a denser coat and the behavioral flexibility to hunt across enormous home ranges in landscape where prey can be sparse and scattered. Yakutia wolves hunt reindeer, elk, and horses, including, occasionally, Yakutia horses, which is one of the reasons that semi-domesticated horse herds in the region are still managed with attention to predator pressure. The relationship between the wolves of Yakutia and the horses is ancient and has shaped the behavior of both. The horse's tendency to form tight groups in winter, the dominant stallion's role in defending the herd, the alertness that even a well-fed and apparently relaxed Yakutia horse displays when something moves at the edge of its vision. Millennia of predator-prey coevolution are encoded in these behaviors, running below the surface of an animal that looks, from a distance, like it is simply standing in the snow not doing very much. The Siberian tiger famously ranges into parts of the Russian Far East, but not into Yakutia proper. The cold is too extreme even for that magnificent animal. The apex predator of the Yakutia taiga is the brown bear, though the bear's contribution to the winter ecosystem is largely suspended during the coldest months, when it is denning and dormant. Bears in Yakutia den in late autumn and emerge in spring with a timing calibrated to the seasonal availability of food. They are present in the landscape as a force of summer and autumn but absent as an active presence in the deep winter when temperatures are most extreme. A bear in January in Yakutia is tucked into a den beneath a fallen tree or in a hillside cavity, its heart rate reduced to a fraction of its active level, its body temperature only slightly lowered from normal, surviving the winter on the fat reserves accumulated during the autumn hyperphagia, the frantic, compulsive eating that precedes denning, and which can see a bear consuming 20,000 calories per day at its peak. The birds of Yakutia's winter are few and specialized. Most migratory species have long departed for warmer latitudes by the time the deep cold sets in. Yakutia is, in summer, an extraordinary birding landscape, with millions of waterfowl using its wetlands and rivers as breeding grounds. But the birds that remain through winter are the cold specialists. The Siberian jay, the Siberian tit, the various species of owl, and most magnificently, the stellar sea eagle, which overwinters along the unfrozen stretches of Yakutian rivers and is one of the largest and most powerful birds of prey on Earth. The great gray owl, the world's largest owl by length, though not by mass, hunts through Yakutian winters with a facial disc so large and so precisely structured that it can locate a mouse moving under 30 centimeters of snow by sound alone, hearing the thermal signature of a small mammal's movement through a layer of packed snow that renders it completely invisible. The owl then plunges through the snow surface, following the sound, and catches prey it could not see. This is winter hunting in Yakutia at the avian level, not a comfortable or casual enterprise, but one the owl is specifically built for. And then there are the mammoths. Not present, not alive, not wandering, but present in the sense that matters most in Yakutia, which is present in the permafrost. The woolly mammoth went extinct approximately 4,000 years ago. The last isolated population held on until around 1650 BCE on Wrangel Island, off the coast of what is now Chukotka, but the permafrost of Yakutia has been producing frozen mammoth remains with a regularity that makes them almost, if not quite, routine. Thousands of mammoth specimens have been recovered from Yakutian permafrost over the centuries, ranging from scattered bones and isolated tusks to, occasionally, specimens of breathtaking completeness. Animals frozen so rapidly and preserved so thoroughly that muscle tissue, hair, internal organs, and even stomach contents have survived essentially intact across a gap of 10,000 or more years. The most famous recent discovery from Yakutia's permafrost is Yuka, a juvenile female woolly mammoth found in 2010 on the Laptev seacoast, so well preserved that her pink flesh and chestnut-colored hair were intact, her facial features recognizable, and her last meal, sedge grasses and wildflowers, still identifiable in her stomach. Examining Yuka is not like examining a fossil. It is like examining an animal that died recently, which in a geological sense she did, though the 10,000 years of deep freeze storage has introduced some complications to that analogy. The quality of preservation in some Yakutian mammoth specimens is so high that viable cellular material, including nuclei containing genetic material, has been extracted from muscle tissue, leading to ongoing scientific efforts to recover usable mammoth DNA for potential cloning or genetic revival programs. Whether this is a good idea is a question that scientists, ethicists, and the Jurassic Park franchise have opinions about, and historians still argue whether the technical barriers to mammoth de-extinction are fundamentally solvable with current or near-future biotechnology or represent challenges that will remain prohibitive indefinitely. The Yakutian permafrost is not only yielding mammoths. Ancient horses, cave lions, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, and a variety of smaller mammals have been recovered in varying states of preservation. In 2018, the permafrost released 2 cave lion cubs, Spartak and Boris, frozen so perfectly that they appeared merely to be sleeping, their expressions peaceful, their fur intact, their tiny paws curled. Cave lions went extinct approximately 14,000 years ago. The cubs are estimated to be between 1 and 2 months old at the time of their death and have been dated to approximately 28,000 years ago. Looking at their photographs, widely circulated at the time of announcement, is one of those experiences that produces a very specific sensation. The past becoming present in a way that bypasses intellectual processing and hits something more visceral. They are too complete, too recognizable, too vivid to feel like artifacts. They feel like animals. The quirky footnote here, and there is always a quirky footnote in Yakutia, is that the mammoth ivory trade is entirely legal and has been a significant economic activity in the region for centuries. Unlike elephant ivory, which is banned under international wildlife treaties, mammoth ivory is fossil material and can be legally sold and traded. Yakutia produces the majority of the world's mammoth ivory. The permafrost releases tusks with every thaw cycle, carried out by river erosion or exposed by coastal processes, and the ivory is carved into jewelry, figurines, and art objects sold internationally. There is something genuinely strange about a luxury goods market built on the tusks of animals that died during the last ice age, but Yakutia manages it with characteristic matter-of-factness. The mammoth is in the permafrost. The permafrost is thawing slightly more each year. The tusks are coming out. Someone is going to use them, and it might as well be someone local. The animals of Yakutia are, in aggregate, a catalog of solutions to the problem of cold, each species representing a different evolutionary answer to the same fundamental question of how to stay alive when the world is trying to freeze you. The horse pawing through snow for grass. The owl hunting by sound through packed snow. The bear sleeping through the worst of it on a year's worth of accumulated fat. The reindeer with its seasonal hooves and ultraviolet eyes. And beneath all of them, in the permafrost, the mammoth, the grandest cold-weather animal of all, frozen mid-stride in time, waiting to be found. Outside your window, your actual window, wherever you are reading this, the world is probably not that cold. But somewhere, a Yakutian horse is standing in the dark and the freeze, shaggy and compact and absolutely unbothered, breathing out small clouds of frozen breath into a sky full of stars, doing what it has done for thousands of years, which is simply being exactly what it is in exactly the place it belongs. Word count, 3098. Awaiting, continue. Section 7. You wake up. It is 7 in the morning in Yakutsk in January, and the darkness outside your window is total. Not the soft, sodium-orange darkness of a city night in a temperate climate, but a deep, complete geographical darkness, the kind that has weight and presence and that the 3 or 4 hours of gray twilight arriving later this morning will barely dent. The temperature outside is minus 52 degrees Celsius. This is not an unusual morning. This is not a weather event. This is Tuesday. You lie in bed for a moment, a warm bed, in a heated apartment, the central district heating system doing its reliable, coal-powered work through those above-ground insulated pipes. And you run through the mental checklist that every Yakutsk resident runs through every deep winter morning without necessarily being conscious of running it. What do I need to do today? How long will I be outside? What am I wearing? Is the car running? The car question is not a small one. If you own a car in Yakutsk and you park it outside, which many residents do, garages being a premium, you have one of 3 options for keeping it functional through a Yakutian winter night. Option 1, you leave the engine running. All night. This sounds wasteful, and it is, in the sense that it burns fuel continuously for 8 or 10 or 12 hours, but it is considerably less wasteful than the alternative, which is attempting to start a car whose engine oil has congealed to something approaching the consistency of cold butter and whose battery has lost most of its capacity to the cold. Option 2, you use a block heater, an electric heating element installed in the engine block that keeps the oil and coolant above freezing when the car is plugged into an electrical outlet overnight. Yakutsk has electrical outlets for this purpose installed in parking lots and along streets. The small orange extension cords dangling from cars into street-level power points, a familiar visual element of the winter cityscape. Option 3, you park in a heated garage if you are fortunate enough to have access to one, and you pay for that fortune in monthly fees that reflect the genuine premium on enclosed, heated parking space in a city where enclosed, heated anything is a survival asset. The drive to work, school, or anywhere else in Yakutsk in deep winter is conducted in a car whose interior takes several minutes to warm to a temperature at which the windows can be properly defrosted, during which time you are driving in a vehicle that is simultaneously heated by the engine warming up and frosted on every glass surface, a combination that requires the practiced patience of someone who has done this many hundreds of times. The roads are compacted snow and ice from approximately October to April. Studded tires are standard equipment, not an option, and the ice road surfaces, while slippery by the standards of a driver who encounters them rarely, become navigable through sheer accumulated experience by drivers who have been on them every winter for decades. Speed is moderated not just by traction concerns, but by the knowledge that a breakdown on an isolated road in minus 50 degrees Celsius is not a minor inconvenience waiting for roadside assistance. It is a situation that requires solving quickly, because the car that stops running in extreme cold begins losing its interior temperature at a rate that makes the timeline for serious hypothermia uncomfortably short. The school run in Yakutsk is one of the more quietly extraordinary aspects of daily life in the city, because Yakutsk schools do not close for cold. This is a policy that consistently produces astonishment in people from temperate climates, where a forecast of minus 10 degrees Celsius produces school closures and anxious social media posts about keeping children safe. In Yakutsk, Schools have a cold threshold below which outdoor activities are canceled and children are kept inside during breaks. But classes themselves continue. That threshold, the temperature at which Yakutsk schools consider the weather too severe for children to be outside during recess, is approximately minus 52 degrees Celsius for primary school children and somewhat lower for older students. Not minus 5 degrees Celsius. Not minus 15 degrees Celsius. Minus 52. Below that threshold, children play inside. Above it, which is to say, at temperatures between minus 40 degrees Celsius and minus 52 degrees Celsius, they go outside for their breaks, bundled in their full cold weather gear, and they run around and play games and do the things that children do at recess, just with significantly more layers and considerably more frozen breath. The children of Yakutsk walk to school in groups, faces almost entirely covered by fur-trimmed hoods and scarves, only their eyes visible, moving briskly because moving briskly is not optional at these temperatures. It is thermodynamic necessity. The walk to school in deep winter is timed and direct. There is no dawdling. There is no stopping to look at something interesting on the way. There is a route, and the route is executed with efficiency, and then you are inside, and the frosted scarves and hat brims begin to thaw in the warmth of the school entrance hall, releasing small drips of meltwater onto the mat. This daily experience, the transition from the absolute cold outside to the warmth inside, repeated multiple times per day, is so fundamental to winter life in Yakutsk that children grow up with a finely calibrated understanding of their own body's thermal states that children in warmer climates simply never develop. They know exactly how cold they are. They know the difference between comfortable cold and dangerous cold. They know the signs of their extremities beginning to complain, and they know what to do about it. The school curriculum in Yakutia includes, from early ages, practical cold weather survival education. Not as an emergency preparedness exercise conducted once a year, but as a genuine, practical subject woven into physical education and life skills. Children learn how to recognize frostbite in themselves and others, how to warm a cold hand correctly, gradually, with body heat, not with hot water, how to behave if stranded in cold weather, and how to construct basic emergency shelter. This knowledge is not theoretical. It is skills education for the environment these children actually live in, and the casualness with which Yakutian children discuss cold weather survival topics, the matter-of-fact expertise they display when explaining, say, what you should do if your fingers go white, is one of those things that visitors to the region find slightly disorienting until they recalibrate their expectations. The phenomenon of frozen eyelashes deserves its own paragraph, because it is both universal in the Yakutian winter experience and genuinely strange the first time you encounter it. At temperatures below approximately minus 30 degrees Celsius, the moisture from the eye, the normal, constant lubrication of the eye surface, begins to freeze on the eyelashes with each blink, accumulating as tiny ice crystals that make the lashes heavy and slightly stiff. By minus 50 degrees Celsius, if you are outside for more than a few minutes, your eyelashes carry a visible frost that makes them appear white and somewhat dramatic, as though you have been cast in a very cold theatrical production. The sensation is not painful. The crystals are small enough not to cause discomfort, but the visual effect in a mirror afterwards is arresting. Eyebrows accumulate frost from exhaled breath redirected upward by the face covering. Beards and mustaches, if worn, become spectacular accumulations of ice within minutes of going outside, the exhaled breath freezing immediately on contact with the facial hair. Men with beards in Yakutia in January look, by the time they have been outside for 15 minutes, as though they have been specifically decorated by a special effects team. This is, reportedly, not as charming as it looks from the outside. The social life of Yakutsk in deep winter operates on a rhythm calibrated to cold in ways that are subtle but pervasive. Social gatherings happen indoors, obviously, but the timing of outdoor transitions between venues is planned with an attention to temperature that socializing in temperate cities never requires. You do not walk between restaurants in January in Yakutsk as a casual interlude. You plan the route, you dress appropriately for the transit, and you move between heated spaces with purpose. The culture of hospitality in Yakutian homes is warm in both the literal and figurative sense. Guests who come in from the cold are offered hot food and drink immediately, because the restoration of core temperature after even a brief cold exposure is a social priority, not just a courtesy. The tea culture of Yakutia is substantial, as it is across much of Siberia and Central Asia, and it makes complete thermodynamic sense. Hot liquid delivered rapidly to a cold body is one of the most efficient ways to transfer thermal energy to the core quickly, And the ritual of tea preparation and sharing, the samovar, the proper glasses, the deliberate warmth of the process, is as much a heating technology as it is a social one. Yakushin tea is often drunk with butter or cream, fats that add caloric density and slow the absorption of the warmth, prolonging the thermal benefit, and sometimes with salt, a practice that reflects the traditional dietary priorities of a culture that valued mineral retention in a physically demanding cold environment. The outdoor festivals and cultural events of Yakutia present a fascinating case of collective cold management. The decision of an entire community to be outside together in extreme temperatures for the purpose of celebration and cultural expression. The most significant annual event is Yakutia, the traditional Saka midsummer festival celebrated around the summer solstice, which takes place in the warmth of June and July and involves dancing, games, and the ceremonial consumption of kumis, fermented mare's milk, in an atmosphere of genuine communal joy. But there are winter festivals too, and the approach to outdoor winter events in Yakutia involves the same pragmatic cold management that governs everything else. Events are structured to minimize cold exposure time, transition spaces are provided, and the community's collective tolerance for cold as a background condition allows outdoor winter cultural life to proceed at temperatures that would halt similar events anywhere else. The humor of Yakutia about its own cold is, as previously promised, a real and distinctive genre, and it has migrated successfully to the internet. Yakushin social media accounts dedicated to posting temperature readings alongside deadpan commentary have international followings, because there is something universally appealing about the combination of extreme conditions and absolute composure. A post reading simply -56 degrees Celsius today. Good day for fishing, accompanied by a photograph of someone cheerfully ice fishing generates engagement worldwide, because the gap between the condition described and the emotional register of the description is so vast and so perfectly played. The cold humor of Yakutia operates on this gap. The humor is in what is not said, in the shrug that is implied, in the cultural statement that this temperature, which would be a headline emergency anywhere else, is simply today's weather, and today's weather is something you just get on with. One of the funnier and entirely genuine cold weather phenomena of Yakushin winter life involves the behavior of metal in extreme cold. Door handles seize, locks freeze, hinges stiffen to the point of requiring significant force to operate, and applying significant force to a metal object that is at -50 degrees Celsius while wearing heavy mittens is an interesting physical challenge. Car door seals freeze to the frame overnight, requiring a specific technique of pressure applied at the right point to break the seal without damaging it. Keys left outside will crack if the metal is stressed while very cold. These are not dramatic failures but constant, low-level negotiations with the physical properties of materials that most of the world never needs to think about, and the Yakushin approach to all of them is the same. You know about this, you have a technique, you apply the technique, you move on. The cold is not a surprise. It never is. The nighttime routine of a Yakutsk household in deep winter closes the day with its own cold weather rituals. The heating is checked, the apartment should be at a comfortable temperature, and any deviation is noted and investigated, because a heating system issue in January is addressed tonight, not tomorrow. Clothing for tomorrow is laid out and checked, the full system from innermost layer to outermost, because discovering a missing mitten at 7 in the morning when you are already dressed is a problem with a cold solution. Windows are checked for frost accumulation at the seals, an indicator of thermal bridging that can worsen over the course of a cold snap. The car, if parked outside, is either running or plugged in. And then, finally, you are horizontal. The bed in Yakutsk in winter is a place that holds a significance that beds in warmer places simply cannot quite match. It is warm in a way that is genuinely precious, the warmth of insulated blankets over a heated room, the warmth of a body that has spent the day managing its thermal budget in a -50 degrees Celsius environment and can now finally stop managing. The release into warmth is not taken for granted in Yakutia. It is felt. The contrast between the cold that has been present all day as a constant background fact and the warmth of the bed at the end of it is a nightly reminder of what warmth actually means. Not a neutral baseline but an achievement, a victory, a thing the cold would take if you let it. You do not let it. You have the house and the layers and the food and the knowledge and the community and the long tradition of everyone who figured this out before you. You pull the blanket up and the darkness outside is -52 degrees Celsius and full of stars, and you are warm and you sleep. Word count, 3,121. Awaiting, continue. Section 8. Beneath the city where you just fell asleep, beneath the stilted apartment blocks and the above-ground pipe networks and the permafrost cellars full of frozen fish, there is a laboratory. Not a metaphorical one. A literal, functioning scientific research facility carved directly into the permafrost itself, where the walls are ice and the temperature is constant and the work being done inside is some of the most consequential climate science happening anywhere on Earth right now. The Melnikov Permafrost Institute in Yakutsk has been studying the frozen ground beneath Yakutia since 1960, and within its permafrost tunnel, a corridor excavated into the living permafrost beneath the city. Researchers work surrounded by ice that has been frozen for tens of thousands of years, examining it for what it can tell us about the past, the present, and a future that is becoming increasingly complicated. The permafrost tunnel is not a comfortable working environment, even by Yakutian standards. The temperature inside is a constant -5 degrees Celsius to -8 degrees Celsius year-round, warmer than the outdoor temperatures in January, significantly colder than any office environment you have ever worked in. The walls of the tunnel are not smooth. They are studded with the preserved remains of ancient organic material, roots and plant fragments, and occasionally bones, embedded in the ice like exhibits in a museum that the Earth itself curated over thousands of years. Working in the permafrost tunnel is working inside geological time, surrounded by evidence of climates and ecosystems that predate human civilization, and the scientists who do it regularly describe the experience in terms that go beyond the merely professional. There is something about physical proximity to 10,000-year-old ice that the intellect processes differently from reading about it on a screen. The science of permafrost is itself a relatively young discipline. The systematic study of frozen ground did not begin in earnest until the 20th century, and the Soviets, who had the most permafrost and the most urgent practical reasons to understand it, were among the pioneers. Building cities and infrastructure on permafrost was a Soviet necessity. Siberia's resources required exploitation, and exploitation required settlements and transport networks in places where the ground was permanently frozen, and the engineering problems that resulted drove the development of permafrost science as a practical discipline. The Melnikov Institute grew from this context, and its early decades were focused largely on the engineering challenges of construction on permafrost. How thick is the frozen layer? How stable is it? How does it respond to thermal disturbance? And what happens when it thaws? The answers to those questions turned out to be interesting far beyond their engineering applications. Permafrost, it emerged, is not simply frozen dirt. It is a vast archive. The organic material trapped in permafrost, dead plant matter, ancient soils, the remains of animals and insects and microscopic organisms, has been locked away from the decomposition processes that normally break organic material down and return its constituent elements to the atmosphere. In the permafrost, that material just stays. It does not rot. It does not oxidize. It accumulates, layer upon layer, over thousands of years, building up a repository of ancient organic carbon that dwarfs the carbon stored in all the world's forests combined. Scientists estimate that the permafrost of the Northern Hemisphere contains approximately 1.5 trillion tons of organic carbon, roughly twice the amount currently in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. This number sits in the middle of climate science like a very cold, very large elephant, because what happens to that carbon if the permafrost thaws is a question with world historical implications. The shamanic tradition of Yakutia, meanwhile, has been observing the behavior of the permafrost and the landscape it underlies for far longer than the Melnikov Institute has existed, though it has been doing so through a different interpretive framework. The Oyun, the Saka shaman, understood the landscape as animated by spirits whose moods and behaviors explained the changes observed in the natural world. A sudden ground subsidence, a thermokarst lake appearing where solid ground had been, a river changing course as its banks destabilized. These were, in the shamanic worldview, expressions of the spirit world acting upon the physical landscape. The interpretation was theological rather than geophysical, but the observations themselves were often precise. Traditional Saka ecological knowledge contains detailed records of landscape change, passed down through oral tradition, that modern researchers have found useful for establishing baselines of environmental change that predate instrumental records. The relationship between shamanic tradition and modern science in Yakutia is not the simple opposition that a certain kind of Western narrative would construct, ancient superstition versus rational inquiry, one destined to be replaced by the other. It is considerably more interesting than that. Yakutia has produced scientists of international distinction who are also practicing participants in Saka cultural life, who understand the shamanic tradition as a distinct and valuable epistemological system, not necessarily in competition with scientific methodology but operating in a different domain. The knowledge held in shamanic tradition about the behavior of the landscape, the patterns of animal movement, the indicators of weather change, this is empirical knowledge of a kind, accumulated through observation over generations, and its insights have informed scientific research in the region in ways that are not always formally acknowledged but are genuine. The Saka shamanic revival of the post-Soviet period is one of the more remarkable cultural developments in the region. Soviet policy toward indigenous religion was, to put it diplomatically, suppressive. Shamanism was classified as superstition, Oyun were persecuted, ritual objects were confiscated, and the practice was driven underground or eliminated in many communities. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 opened a space for cultural reclamation, and the Saka people moved into that space with considerable energy. Shamanic practice has been publicly revived. Cultural centers dedicated to traditional Saka spirituality have been established, and young Saka people have sought out training in shamanic traditions from the remaining elders who preserved the knowledge through the Soviet period. This revival is not universally welcomed. There are debates within Saka society about authenticity, about the commercialization of shamanic tradition for tourism purposes, about what constitutes genuine practice versus performance, but it represents a living, contested, energetically maintained cultural tradition rather than a museum piece. The Olanko performers, the Olankosits, are the secular counterparts of the shamans in the traditional Saka cultural framework, the keepers of the great oral epic tradition we mentioned earlier. The performance of Olanko is a demanding art that requires years of training, a prodigious memory, and the ability to sustain extended narrative performance, sometimes over multiple sessions spanning days, in a style that combines spoken narrative, sung passages, and the vocal imitation of the various characters and spirits of the story. The voice of an Olankosut ranges from the deepest registers used for the monster spirits of the lower world to high, clear tones for the celestial beings of the upper world, with a landscape of vocal character in between. UNESCO's recognition of Olanko as an intangible cultural heritage in 2005 brought international attention to a tradition that had survived Soviet suppression, rapid modernization, and the general homogenizing pressures of the 20th century, and the recognition has been used as a platform for educational programs that teach the tradition to younger generations. The ice cores. We must talk about the ice cores because they are where the shamanic worldview and the scientific one converge most dramatically on the same set of facts. The facts of what the Earth's climate has been doing, and what it is about to do. Yakutia does not have glaciers from which ice cores in the traditional sense can be extracted. It has permafrost, which is a different medium. But the permafrost contains something analogous. Layers of ancient atmosphere, trapped as tiny bubbles in the frozen organic material, dating back hundreds of thousands of years. Analyzing these layers tells researchers about the composition of ancient atmospheres, the concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane at different points in Earth's history, with a precision that represents one of the most powerful tools in paleoclimatology. What the permafrost record shows is a consistent relationship between greenhouse gas concentrations and global temperature. When CO2 and methane go up, temperature follows, and vice versa, across multiple glacial cycles spanning hundreds of thousands of years. This is not new information. The ice core record from Antarctica and Greenland has shown the same pattern for decades. But the permafrost record from Yakutia adds a dimension. It shows what happens to the permafrost itself as temperatures rise, and by extension, what happens to the carbon stored within it. In warmer periods of Earth's past, permafrost thawed, releasing the organic carbon stored within it into the atmosphere as CO2 and methane, which warmed the climate further, which thawed more permafrost, which released more carbon. A self-reinforcing feedback loop that amplified warming episodes into the dramatic climate swings visible in the geological record. This feedback loop, permafrost thaw releasing carbon, carbon warming the climate, warming thawing more permafrost, is exactly what climate scientists are watching for signs of today, and those signs are visible in Yakutia in ways that are both scientifically measurable and, to Yakushan residents, viscerally apparent. Ground that was stable 5 years ago is subsiding. Thermokarst lakes, bodies of water that form in depressions created by permafrost thaw, are appearing in new locations and expanding in existing ones. Riverbanks are collapsing as the permafrost within them softens. Buildings are developing the tilts and cracks that indicate the permafrost foundation beneath them is changing. Historians still argue whether the permafrost changes currently observed in Yakutia are within the range of natural variability seen in previous warm periods or represent the beginning of a feedback process without modern precedent. But the argument is being conducted with increasing urgency and an awareness that the stakes of getting the answer wrong are very high indeed. The methane question is particularly pointed. Methane is a greenhouse gas approximately 80 times more potent than CO2 over a 20-year timescale, and thawing permafrost releases methane in two ways. The first is direct. The decomposition of ancient organic material under partially thawed conditions produces methane as a byproduct of microbial activity, and this methane bubbles up through the soil and into the atmosphere. The second is more spectacular, and the word spectacular is used here with full awareness of its ambiguity. Beneath some areas of Yakutian permafrost, large pockets of methane gas have accumulated over geological time, held in place by the frozen cap of permafrost above them. When that cap thaws, the methane can release explosively, forming the craters that have been appearing in Yakutia's Yamal Peninsula and surrounding regions since at least 2014. These craters, some of them 30 meters across and up to 60 meters deep, with walls of exposed ice and soil, appear with minimal warning and have, in several cases, been heard from significant distances when they formed. They are not currently a threat to populated areas, but their appearance is a visible, dramatic, slightly terrifying illustration of what is happening beneath the surface of the permafrost landscape as temperatures rise. The scientists at the Melnikov Institute and at other permafrost research facilities in Yakutia monitor these changes with instruments that would have seemed extraordinarily sophisticated to the meteorologist who recorded that -71°C reading in 1933. Ground temperature sensors at multiple depths track the thermal state of the permafrost in near real time. Remote sensing from satellites maps thermokarst formation and ground subsidence across enormous areas that could not be monitored on foot. Isotope analysis of methane bubbling from thawing lake bottoms distinguishes between modern biogenic methane and ancient permafrost-derived methane, allowing researchers to track the contribution of thawing permafrost to atmospheric methane concentrations. The data flowing from these monitoring systems is feeding into global climate models that are trying to predict how the permafrost feedback will affect the trajectory of global warming over the coming century. In the evenings, after the instruments are read and the data is logged and the permafrost tunnel has been closed for the day, some of the researchers at the Melnikov Institute go home to apartments in Yakutsk, where the central heating hums through the above-ground pipes and the permafrost cellar beneath the building holds the season's supply of frozen fish, and they sit with their families and drink tea with butter, and perhaps they think about the gap between the ancient frozen world they study and the warming world that is slowly, measurably changing it. And perhaps some of their neighbors, Saka people whose grandparents remembered the Oyun, whose children are learning the Elanco in after-school programs, think about Chiskin, the Lord of Cold, and what it means that the cold is retreating, and what the world looks like when the spirit of winter begins to lose its grip. The two ways of knowing, the scientific and the shamanic, are looking at the same thing from different ends of a very long telescope, and what they both see, with whatever vocabulary they are using to describe it, is change. The permafrost is changing. The cold is changing. And the people who have built their entire civilization on the assumption of permanent freeze are living, with characteristic pragmatism and not a little unease, in the middle of that change, watching it happen. Word count, 3098. Awaiting, continue. Section 9. The paradox arrives quietly, the way the most significant things in Yakutia tend to arrive. Not with drama or announcement, but with a gradual, accumulating insistence that eventually cannot be ignored. The coldest inhabited place on Earth is getting warmer. Not warming in the way that a cold room warms when someone turns up the thermostat, gradually, evenly, controllably, but warming in the way that a structure built on ice warms when the ice beneath it begins, slowly and then less slowly, to change state. The warmth is coming from outside the system, from the accumulated greenhouse gases of 2 centuries of industrialization happening mostly far away from Yakutia, in factories and power plants and automobile engines in places where the people running them have never seen permafrost and have no immediate reason to think about what happens when it thaws. And yet here, in the coldest corner of the inhabited world, the consequences of that distant warmth are among the most visible and most consequential on Earth. The numbers are specific, and specificity matters here. Yakutia has warmed by approximately 3 degrees Celsius over the past 50 years, roughly 3 times the global average warming rate, which is itself already alarming by the standards of climate science. The Arctic and subarctic regions warm faster than the global average due to a phenomenon called Arctic amplification, a set of feedback mechanisms, including the reduction of reflective ice and snow cover that would otherwise bounce solar energy back into space, that accelerate warming at high latitudes relative to the tropics and temperate zones. 3 degrees of average warming does not sound catastrophic to a human body accustomed to experiencing temperature swings of 30 or 40 degrees between seasons. But to the permafrost, to a geological system calibrated over millennia to maintain a specific thermal state, 3 degrees of average warming is an enormous perturbation, with consequences that propagate through every system built upon or within the frozen ground. The infrastructure consequences are already visible and already expensive. The buildings of Yakutsk that we described earlier, perched on their permafrost piles, thermally isolated from the warming ground, are increasingly finding that the permafrost those piles are anchored in is less stable than it was when the buildings were constructed. Surveys of Yakutsk's building stock have found that a significant percentage of the city's structures have developed deformation, cracking, or foundation instability attributable at least in part to permafrost changes. The cost of monitoring, repairing, and in some cases demolishing and replacing compromised infrastructure in Yakutia runs to billions of rubles annually and is increasing. Roads built on permafrost develop waves and sinkholes as the ground beneath them settles unevenly. Pipelines laid through permafrost regions require constant monitoring for ground movement that can stress joints and cause leaks. The airports of remote Yakutian communities, often the only connection to the outside world, are built on permafrost runways that must be carefully managed as ground conditions change. The winter roads, those frozen river surfaces that serve as critical transport arteries for communities with no other overland connection, are becoming less reliable. The season during which river ice is thick enough to support heavy vehicle traffic is shortening at both ends as warmer autumns delay freeze-up and warmer springs accelerate thaw. Communities that once had 4 months of reliable winter road access now have 3, or less, with significant variability between years. The practical consequences of this shortening are immediate and serious. The window for delivering fuel, food, building materials, and heavy equipment to remote communities is compressed. The cost of flying supplies in as an alternative to road delivery is substantially higher, and the communities themselves have less time to stockpile the materials they need for the following year. The logistics of remote Yakutian life were already complex and expensive. The changing climate is making them more so. The wildfires are perhaps the most counterintuitive consequence of warming in the coldest place on Earth. And they are real and they are serious. Yakutia has always had wildfires, the boreal forest is a fire-adapted ecosystem, and lightning-caused fires have always been part of the ecological cycle of the taiga. But the scale and frequency of Yakutian wildfires has increased dramatically in recent decades, in ways that correlate directly with warming temperatures and the associated drying of vegetation. The summer of 2021 was a watershed moment. Wildfires burned across an area of Yakutia roughly the size of Greece, producing smoke plumes visible from space and air quality readings in Yakutsk that briefly reached hazardous levels even in the center of the republic's largest city. The fires burned through forest, through peatland, and, most consequentially for the climate system, through areas of carbon-rich permafrost surface, releasing ancient carbon stored for thousands of years into the atmosphere in a matter of weeks. The fires also created a feedback of their own. Burned areas lose the insulating layer of vegetation and organic material that normally sits on top of the permafrost, shielding it from summer heat. Without that insulating cover, the permafrost beneath burned areas thaws more rapidly and to greater depths than in unburned areas, exposing more ancient carbon to decomposition and releasing more greenhouse gases, which contribute to further warming, which dries more vegetation, which makes more fires more likely. The feedback is not hypothetical. It is observable, measurable, and currently operating in Yakutia's landscape in real time. The human consequences within Yakutia are distributed unevenly, as climate consequences tend to be. The indigenous communities, the Saka, the Evenki, the Yukagir, who maintain traditional subsistence lifestyles based on fishing, reindeer herding, and hunting are experiencing disruptions to the ecological systems those livelihoods depend on in ways that have no simple technological fix. Fish populations in some Yakutian rivers are changing as water temperatures shift. Cold water species that thrive in the frigid conditions of a fully frozen winter river system are under pressure from warming water temperatures, while other species move into ranges they did not previously occupy. The reindeer herding routes that Evenki communities have followed for generations are being disrupted by changing snow conditions. Warmer temperatures create more frequent Thori freeze cycles that produce ice layers within the snowpack, and reindeer cannot paw through ice to reach the lichen beneath in the way they can through soft snow. When reindeer cannot access food, herd condition declines rapidly, and the communities whose food security depends on those herds feel the consequences directly. The city of Yakutsk, paradoxically, is in some ways better positioned to adapt to warming than the remote communities, because it has the infrastructure, the economic base, and the access to expertise that adaptation requires. The city is already investing in research and monitoring of its permafrost foundation, retrofitting buildings with improved thermal management systems, and developing engineering standards for new construction that account for projected permafrost changes over the coming decades. These are expensive and technically demanding interventions, but they are possible in a city with a university, an engineering sector, and a connection to national and international research networks. A small Evenki reindeer herding community in the remote taiga does not have the same resources for adaptation, and the gap between urban and rural adaptive capacity is one of the defining inequities of climate change in Yakutia as elsewhere. The cultural consequences of a warming Yakutia are harder to quantify but no less real. A culture built so entirely on the cold, on the specific properties of permafrost, on frozen rivers as roads, on the cold as food storage, on the cold as the shaping force of architecture and clothing and cuisine and cosmology, faces an existential question when the cold begins to retreat. Not an immediate existential question. Yakutia is not going to become balmy anytime soon. The projections for the region still involve winters of extreme cold for the foreseeable future, albeit winters that are somewhat less extreme than they were in previous centuries. But the direction of change is clear, and the culture is old enough and self-aware enough to understand what direction of change means. The Saka response to this awareness is characteristically pragmatic and characteristically layered. At the practical level, there is active engagement with climate science. Yakutian researchers and institutions are among the most active in permafrost and subarctic climate research globally, motivated by the simple fact that they live in the place where the changes are most visible and most consequential. At the cultural level, there is a parallel intensification of efforts to document, teach, and practice traditional Saka knowledge, the Elanco programs, the shamanic revival, the traditional clothing and food practices that reads, in part, as a cultural immune response to the threat of erasure. If the cold that shaped us is changing, the reasoning seems to go, then we must hold the culture it shaped even more carefully. Chiskan, the Lord of Cold, is still celebrated in Yakutia. The Pole of Cold Festival in Oymyakon draws visitors from around the world every year in January, bringing tourists to the coldest inhabited place in the Northern Hemisphere to experience the cold under controlled, managed, carefully guided conditions. Visitors are photographed at the monument marking the -71.2 degrees Celsius record. They throw boiling water into the air and watch it freeze. They eat stroganina and drink fermented mare's milk and have their photographs taken with Yakutian horses and marvel at the landscape and go home to write about it in tones of awed disbelief. The tourism infrastructure around Yakutia's extreme cold is growing, and it represents both a genuine economic opportunity and a cultural dynamic that the Saka navigate with some care. The commodification of your homeland's defining characteristic for outside consumption is a transaction that requires managing your own relationship to it. There is something quietly moving about the Pole of Cold Festival, about the fact that people fly to Oymyakon in January, which requires considerable commitment, to stand at the coldest place in the inhabited world and experience what it feels like. They are not coming for beaches or ruins or museums, the usual inventory of tourist destinations. They are coming for the cold itself, for the experience of a temperature so extreme it changes the behavior of matter, of air, of the human body, of time somehow. The cold as destination. The cold as the thing worth traveling to see. It is a profound, if accidental, tribute to the power of extreme environments to command attention, and to the culture that has not just survived in this one but made it genuinely, irreducibly home. The younger generation of Yakutia occupies this complex inheritance with a combination of pride, anxiety, and the particular confidence of people who know something most of the world does not. They post their -56 degrees Celsius mornings on social media with deadpan captions. They study permafrost science and Saka linguistics in the same week. They wear traditional fur-trimmed clothing to cultural festivals and Canada Goose jackets to university. They speak Russian and Saka and often English, navigating between the global culture accessible through a smartphone screen and the specific, irreplaceable local culture of a place shaped by the coldest winters in human experience. They are the Yakutia that will face whatever the warming world delivers, and they are doing so with the accumulated practical wisdom of people who have always faced impossible conditions and found, generation after generation, that the conditions were possible after all. The permafrost is still there. Beneath the tilting buildings and the subsiding roads and the expanding thermokarst lakes, beneath the ancient organic carbon and the frozen mammoths and the trapped methane, beneath the entire complex, layered, living record of the past 100,000 years of this landscape's history, the permafrost is still there. Changed, changing, watched by scientists with ground temperature sensors and by elders with the memory of how the land looked and behaved differently when they were young. But still there, still frozen, still holding within it the extraordinary archive of the deep past and the urgent questions of the near future. And the cold still comes. Every October, the temperatures begin their descent. Every November, the Lena River begins to freeze. Every December, the darkness settles in and the ice fog rises over the city, and the cars are left running and the children bundle their faces in fur, and the stroganina is shaved into translucent curls in unheated rooms, and the Yakutian horses paw through snow for frozen grass under a sky so full of stars it seems almost irresponsible. The cold still comes, and the people of Yakutia still meet it with the same combination of preparation and composure and dark humor and genuine pride that they always have. The record of -71°C still stands, carved in stone outside a small village in a valley that collects the coldest air in the northern hemisphere, like a bowl collecting snowmelt. Chiskin still rules the winter, even if his grip is slightly, measurably looser than it once was. The story of Yakutia is not a story about survival in spite of impossible conditions. It is a story about the transformation of impossible conditions into home, the long, patient, ingenious, culturally rich process by which human beings take the hardest thing their environment offers and make it into the thing that defines them. The cold did not defeat the Saka people. It made them, and what it made is still here, still cold, still beautiful, still proud, watching the thermometer and the permafrost monitors and the horizon with equal attention, ready for whatever the next winter brings. And now, let the story settle around you like a blanket being slowly, carefully drawn up. The numbers and the names and the temperatures can drift a little now. Let them go soft at the edges, the way ice does when warmth finally reaches it. You do not need to hold any of it tightly. It will be there when you return to it, preserved, like everything in Yakutia, by the cold. Somewhere, far to the northeast, in a valley that collects the world's coldest air, the night is absolute and the stars are unimaginable in their number and brightness, and the silence has a texture, and the breath of a sleeping Yakutian horse rises in small frozen clouds toward a sky that has watched this place for longer than the word cold has existed in any human language. The horse is warm enough. The family in the house nearby is warm enough. The permafrost is holding, for now, beneath its insulating blanket of snow and time, and you are warm. Genuinely, completely, unremarkably warm, the warmth of a person who does not have to think about warmth because the thinking has already been done, by architects and heating engineers and by all the generations before you who figured out, one cold lesson at a time, how to make the world habitable. Let that warmth hold you. Let the darkness behind your eyes be the good darkness. The dark of a sky full of stars over a frozen river. The dark of a world at rest. The dark of a night that is cold and beautiful and very, very far away. The Yakutian winter goes on without you. The stars will slowly overhead. The cold settles deeper into the valley. And somewhere in the silence, barely audible, is the sound of breath freezing in still air, that soft, sustained hiss that the Yakuts call the whisper of the stars. Listen to it just for a moment, then sleep. Word count, 3,112. End of script. Sweet dreams.